Now, remember, in Greek mythology, Kronos is the embodiment of Saturn. Kronos is Saturn. And remember, he's considered the god of time. And he's the son of Gaia and Uranus. Gaia being earth and Uranus being heaven. And Gaia falls out of love with Uranus because of the way he was treating some of their children. And she ends up asking her children to take out her husband, Uranus. And the only one that steps up to take his father out is Kronos. And Kronos ends up overthrowing his father by castrating him with his scythe. And this castration ends up separating Gaia from Uranus, or in other words, separating the heavens from the earth. So you got Saturn separating the earth from space. And after Kronos does this, he takes the throne and becomes king of the gods, the god of time. So you got time controlled by Saturn, separating the earth from space. And in the mythology, after Kronos becomes king, he marries Rhea, the daughter of Gaia. He learns this prophecy that one of his children is going to eventually overthrow him. And so to prevent this from happening, every time his wife had a child, he would swallow the child whole, trapping them inside of him alive. And he did this with every single child that Rhea produced. And after being forced to watch him do this 5 times, his wife Rhea couldn't take it anymore. And so as soon as the 6th child was born, she hid him away. And this time, instead of giving Kronos the baby, she gave Kronos a rock to try and trick him into thinking that he had swallowed another child. And it had become such a routine thing for Kronos to swallow these children as soon as they were born that he didn't even notice. And of course, this 6th child that managed to escape Kronos was Zeus. And when Zeus gets old enough and becomes stronger, he comes back and helps his brothers and sisters escape from Kronos by causing Kronos to vomit them back out of his belly. And of course, they work together to eventually defeat and overthrow Kronos. So you have Kronos, aka Saturn, swallowing his children and swallowing them alive, trapping them inside of him. And all of these children are birthed out of his wife, Rhea, who represents the earth. So you have these children originating from the earth who end up being consumed by Saturn because of something inside of them that tied them back to Saturn. And the one and only child to avoid being swallowed by Saturn is able to do that by being sent to a place far away from Saturn where he could develop and grow. And because of this, he's able to ultimately come back and defeat Saturn. By staying away from Saturn, he's able to avoid being consumed by Saturn. So it's almost like this story is saying the only way you can defeat Saturn and avoid being consumed by it is by separating yourself from it, like Zeus was separated from Kronos. And what is Saturn? The hexagon. 6 sides, 6 vertices, 6 angles, 6, 6, 6, 6 protons, 6 electrons, 6 neutrons, carbon 12, 6, 6, 6. So to break away from Saturn would mean to break away from carbon 12, your lower self, your inner beast. And again, in this story, we've got Zeus, this child of Saturn, manifested through the earth, separating himself from Saturn. Very similar to Jesus separating himself from the material world around him and saying that this is the only way to get to God. And we know this is all allegories, stories with a deeper meaning. And we know that that name Jesus couldn't have existed before the 16th century because there was no letter J before the 16th century. And of course, Jesus in Latin is Jesus, Zeus. And it comes from the Greek, Lesus, the Zeus. So it's all the same thing and ultimately with the same message. To escape whatever this is that we are in, you have to detach yourself from Saturn, aka Satan, and you have to escape into your higher mind. To avoid being consumed, you have to break your attachment to what is being consumed, that carbon 12 666 beast. And it's like there's other little hints put out there with things like the DreamWorks logo, where you have what looks like the soul of a boy sitting on the moon fishing. And mind you, when they first dropped this logo, it started out with just the boy on the moon fishing. And then eventually, instead of just that crescent moon, they gave us a visual of a full moon with what looks like that soul inside. Clearly, that fishing line is going down to whatever is underneath the moon. And as far as we know, the only thing below the moon is the earth. So is it possible that he's trying to reel in other souls like him from the earth? When you look at the way that the fishing line and the rod are positioned, it looks very similar to Saturn's scythe going from the moon down to the earth. And remember, from Saturn, we eventually got the Grim Reaper, aka the collector of souls, carrying around that same scythe. And given that strong association with death, you know what they say, when you die, this is who is coming to collect, the Grim Reaper. And again, what are they calling Saturn's moon, Mimas? The Death Star. And remember, the Pope in Rome wears the ring of the fisherman. And who is the fisherman on the ring? Saint Peter. And they had that depiction of Saint Peter in the Vatican in Rome with that halo above his head. And we know in Rome, we have this long history of the worship of Saturn. It seems like a strong chance that that fisherman is Saturn. And we got to think about this whole idea of reincarnation and how this might play into that. Because it seems like very subtly, we're being clued into this idea that when our souls leave these bodies, they are not traveling very far from this planet. And that somehow Saturn may be playing a significant part in this. We've got all of these correlations between Saturn and Earth. So many things connecting these two planets to each other. So if there's any chance that there's some type of reincarnation of our souls happening, it seems like a strong possibility that that cycle of reincarnation will be taking place between the Earth and Saturn. You can look at something like the symbol for recycling, a symbol that we see used all around the world. So many different countries, so many different places. No matter where you go, we all recognize this symbol and we all know what it represents. This is the universal symbol for recycling. But when you actually look at the symbol and the shape that it forms, you can see that the recycle symbol is actually forming a hexagon. And we know that hexagon can very easily take us back to Saturn. And then you think about what it means to recycle, to reprocess something over and over again in a continuous loop. So is it a coincidence or is it another one of those subtle hints? Even the way that they make some of these models pose. I mean, obviously, they probably have no clue why they're being told to pose the way they're being told to pose. They most likely land a job and they just do the pose they're told to do. But clearly, we know where these hand signs and this symbolism is going to lead you. And again, it's like they are subtly letting you know that there is a link between reincarnation, that carbon 12 666, and Saturn. Remember, Saturn's moon, Mimas, is the Death Star. Well, remember, you got Mimas devouring the beast, or in other words, devouring that carbon 12 that the majority of the human body is composed of. So you've got time and death connected to this moon Mimas, which is also creating the largest division in Saturn's rings. But remember, you also have the moon Pan, that moon that looks like that mutated version of Saturn. Is creating its own division in Saturn's rings, the Inky division. And we know this division is created by Pan because of that strong gravitational force that it has. Remember, Pan is Saturn's smallest moon, but has one of the strongest gravitational forces. But because that gravitational force of Pan is so strong, as it pushes those particles away and maintains that gap in the rings, it also constantly creates these vibrations in the rings that they literally call waves or wakes. And when you look at them, they do curl and ripple just like waves. And Pan is constantly creating these waves in Saturn's rings. And the waves travel from just within the gap to deep within the rings, where they create these different zigzag formations. Now, again, at the core of this, you have these wave patterns that are forming everything. Now, different wave frequencies are going to fit into different categories, depending on the pattern of that wave, how that wave is moving. And these waves that are created by Pan are actually what's called sine waves. And a sine wave is a frequency that goes in a continuous cycle or loop that repeats itself over and over again, nonstop. And a sine wave is always going to have a high point and a low point, or a positive cycle and a negative cycle that come together and create that frequency or that wave. And it just keeps continuously flowing between these two phases. Now, when you start getting into the math behind this frequency, you're going to see that that frequency of sine actually gets shortened down. And instead of calling it sine, they call it sin. So when you see the frequency on a graph, it's going to be abbreviated as sin. Now, remember, you got Pan sitting in the Inky division, creating these sine waves in Saturn's rings. So you've got Pan creating this frequency of sin in Saturn's rings, while also creating the Inky division. And we know Pan is going to take us back to the Greek god, which is going to take us right back to the devil, the Baphomet, Satan. And then we know with Inky, we're talking about humanity. So you could actually look at this as Satan creating that frequency of sin in humanity through Saturn's rings. Remember what they say, when you're born on this earth, you're born into sin. Or maybe in other words, you're born into that sine frequency. Now, something else that operates on that frequency of sine is actually time. Time is measured as a sine frequency because we know time is a continuous cycle that repeats infinitely, and it has this constant up and down flow to it. So time flows on a sine frequency, or in other words, time flows on a frequency of sin. And think about it. What do they say? The wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life through Jesus Christ. So the wages of time is death. And we all know when you're on this earth, you only have so much time. And it's almost like you're kind of racing against time, because you know, as that frequency of time keeps moving, that it means that you're moving closer and closer toward death. So literally, the wages of sin or time is death. But the gift of God, your higher mind, is eternal life through Jesus. And what was Jesus trying to show us? How to connect with God, our higher mind, and how to separate ourselves from the things of this world, and how to deny Satan, aka Saturn. And it looks like we have this sine wave frequency being created in Saturn's rings. And then, of course, we know Saturn is sending out these radio waves. So it's almost like you have this frequency of sin being sent out from Saturn. And the crazy part is that Sin is actually the Mesopotamian god of the moon. So it's like they're telling you sin links you to the moon. And then we already know when you're talking about the moon and Saturn, you cannot look past that Death Star moon consuming the beast, carbon 12. And when you're dealing with sine waves, in a lot of cases, you're going to have a second waveform that has the same exact shape and the same exact pattern as that sine wave. It's like a 100% identical wave to the sine wave, following that sine wave, move for move and wave for wave, almost like a shadow, like it's being pulled in like a magnet into that same exact frequency as that sine wave. And they call this wave that follows the frequency of the sine wave a cosine wave. Now, we know when you cosine something, you're coming into an agreement with it and basically attaching yourself to whatever that thing is. And in this case, the cosine wave is attaching itself to the sine wave. And again, sine can be looked at as sin, and time flows on a sine frequency. So this cosine wave is attaching itself to sin, and as a result is also keeping itself attached to time, riding that wave of sin, and thus staying looped in that cycle of time indefinitely. Now think about this and how it might connect to the possibility of us repeatedly reincarnating back onto this planet over and over again, co-signing to that frequency of sin, our lower nature, which in theory could be keeping us stuck in that perpetual loop. And that sin is coming from these sine waves being sent out by Pan into Saturn's rings. And remember, according to Norman Bergrun, what is the core of all this different phenomena within Saturn's rings, making all this happen? The ring makers of Saturn. And remember what he said when he was asked what these ring makers look like.
Okay, but if there are craft, there are beings. So are you not positing the idea that those vehicles contain, beings who are, maybe like us?
There is the ship that picked up the Voyager capsule at Alameda Naval Shipyard. There is one image there that shows black people getting off.
So people with dark skin getting off.
Not dark, black.
Black skin.
Really black. Yeah.
Now, we all know there are just two forms of melanin separating human beings: eumelanin and pheomelanin. And of course, eumelanin comes in those two distinct forms: black eumelanin and brown eumelanin. Now, out of these three variations of melanin, the only variation that we don't see expressed physically in the human genome is black eumelanin. But we know scientifically, without that black eumelanin, we wouldn't even be able to have these other forms of melanin. Because in order to get these other tones, brown, etc., you first need black. And as you remove elements from black, you start to get all these other variations of color. You would think that black eumelanin would have to have come first. But again, black eumelanin is something that we don't see expressed physically in any human being on this planet. But again, we've got Norman Bergrun saying that the ring makers of Saturn are black, not dark, black. Now, we know the element giving melanin that dark pigmentation is carbon. And with black eumelanin, you're dealing with a high quantity of pure carbon. And we also know at the core of these different forms of melanin are these different mutations within the DNA, creating these different forms of melanin. Well, of course, science is saying that about 98.5% of our DNA doesn't code anything within our bodies or have any known purpose at all. And they call this percentage of the DNA junk DNA. And they say they don't know what it is or why it's there. They have theories, speculations, but they really don't know why so much of our DNA doesn't code. But when you look at the structure of the human DNA, you're going to see that there's so many elements bringing those DNA strands together. But the most prevalent element within the DNA is carbon. Each individual section of the DNA is made up of about 5 carbon atoms. So it would seem like all of that carbon making up a good amount of our DNA would be linked to these missing elements within us. And that all of that carbon is actually that 98.5% of our DNA that they consider to be junk DNA. And again, we know when you're talking about a high amount of carbon in human beings, black eumelanin cannot be discounted. And think about it. They're saying that about 98.5% of our DNA is this junk DNA. Then they're also saying that 98.9% of the physical world is composed of carbon-12. So only a small percentage of our DNA, which is mostly carbon-based, is actually coded. And only a small percentage of the physical world is made up of carbon-13. It just seems to fit. And it's almost like carbon-13 is the junk DNA in our DNA strand, and possibly the parts of our DNA that connects us to these black beings, these ring makers of Saturn.